It was the kind of August that settles into a town and stays. The air in Kankakee, Illinois, in the summer of 1987 had a particular weight to it, humid and close. The smell of cut grass and river water drifting up from the Kankakee River a few blocks south of downtown. The sound of window units running in the brick storefronts along Court Street. Kids rode their bikes until after dark because the dark was still warm. The Jewel grocery on the north end of town kept its doors propped open on the hottest afternoons, and people came in as much for the cool air as for anything on the shelves. Dennis Wayne Aldrich lived in that town, in a modest green house on Greenwood Avenue, and he had lived there for 41 years. Through the mill closings and the school consolidations and everything else that had quietly rearranged the life of a mid-sized Illinois river city. He had raised 2 children in that house. He had retired from the county roads department the previous spring. He drove a 1983 Ford pickup and kept a vegetable garden in the backyard. And every Thursday evening, he walked 2 miles to his sister Ruth's house for dinner, because Ruth made chicken fried steak the way their mother had, and because he believed strongly in not letting weeks go by without sitting at a table with someone you loved. On Thursday, August 6, 1987, Dennis Aldrich left Ruth's house at 9:15 in the evening and began walking home. He was 62 years old. He knew every block of that route. He had walked it for years. He never arrived. That is not a story about an old man who got confused on a familiar road. That is a story about what one person can do to another and then simply walk away from, and about how 35 years later, a retired schoolteacher in Bloomington, Illinois, sitting at her kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon with a free trial subscription to a genealogy website, found the thread that unraveled all of it. But to understand what she found and why it mattered, you first have to understand who Dennis Aldrich was. And to understand who Dennis Aldrich was, you have to go back to Kankakee. Kankakee, in 1987, was a town in the particular process of becoming something smaller than it used to be. The Bradley-Bourbonnais area had shed manufacturing jobs through the early 1980s, and the downtown that had been busy and self-sufficient through Dennis's working years had acquired a few empty storefronts that no one liked to look at directly. But the neighborhoods were still intact. The street where Dennis lived still had neighbors who waved from their porches, still had a block association that organized the 4th of July cookout, still had the particular gravity of a place where people had chosen to stay because staying meant something to them. Dennis had stayed. He had thought about leaving after his wife Eleanor died in 1983, thought about moving closer to his daughter in Champaign or his son in Joliet. He had decided against it. This was Eleanor's house, and his house, and the garden was Eleanor's project before it was his, and he was not going to let the tomatoes go untended just because he was lonely. He was a quiet man, but not a closed one. He talked to people at the hardware store and at the barber shop on the second Saturday of every month. He gave a small Christmas donation every year to the county food pantry, always in Eleanor's name. He kept a Polaroid camera in the kitchen drawer and took photographs of the garden at every stage of the growing season, a habit he had maintained for 11 years. A slow and careful record of something he loved. His daughter was named Karen, and she was 34 in the summer of 1987, teaching 3rd grade in Champaign. She called on Sunday evenings. She was planning to visit in September. She had mentioned, the last time they spoke, that she thought he seemed well, and he had told her he was. He meant it. His sister Ruth was 60 years old and had been cooking his Thursday dinners for 4 years, ever since Eleanor died. She knew his walk home took 40 minutes. She had asked him more than once to call when he arrived. He always said he would, and almost never did, and she had learned to wait 20 minutes past when he should have arrived, and then call his number herself. And if he didn't pick up, she'd give him a few more minutes, because sometimes he stopped to look at something on the way. On the night of August 6th, Ruth waited the 20 minutes, then called. The phone rang 8 times. She called again, 8 more rings. She called the police at 10:17 p.m. The Kankakee Police Department dispatched 2 officers within 15 minutes. They drove the route between Ruth's house and Greenwood Avenue twice, slowly with their windows down and their spotlights sweeping the sidewalks and yards. They found nothing. No Dennis. No sign of a disturbance. The neighborhood was quiet and warm and smelled like summer. A search began at first light the following morning. Volunteers from the neighborhood joined officers in walking the blocks between Ruth's house and Greenwood Avenue and then expanding outward. By noon on Friday, August 7th, they had covered a 12-block radius and found nothing. Dennis's Ford pickup was still in his driveway. His house key was on his kitchen counter. He had not taken it with him, which was normal, because Ruth had a spare and he sometimes came back late and didn't want to fuss with locks. His billfold was in the bedroom dresser. He had taken nothing. He had simply vanished somewhere between Ruth's front door and his own. The detective assigned to the case was a 29-year veteran of the Kankakee Police Department named Sergeant Willis Garner. He was 53 years old, heavy-set, with a reputation among colleagues for working cases until they were finished or until he retired, whichever came first. He had worked missing persons before. He had worked homicides. He knew the difference between a man who left and a man who was taken, and Dennis Aldrich, by every measure in front of him, had not left. Garner canvassed the route himself, on foot, on the afternoon of August 7th. He spoke to 11 residents on the blocks between the 2 houses. A woman on Merchant Street, a Mrs. Ida Pulaski, told him she had been on her porch around 9:30 and had seen a man she didn't recognize walking north, moving quickly, she said, more quickly than people walked on summer evenings. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. She described a heavy-set man in dark clothing, middle-aged or older, moving in a direction away from where Dennis was heading. Garner wrote it down. He asked her if she'd seen a truck, a car, anything else. She hadn't. 3 days into the search, a maintenance crew clearing brush along the Kankakee River embankment, 3/4 of a mile from Ruth's house, made a discovery that stopped the search from being a missing persons case. Dennis Aldrich had gone into the river. The recovery confirmed what Garner had already begun to suspect. The manner of Dennis's death, as documented in the Kankakee County Medical Examiner's report, was consistent with blunt force trauma prior to entering the water. This was not an accident. This was not a man who slipped. Someone had been waiting for Dennis Aldrich on that warm August night, and when he came walking by, they had not let him pass. The question of who and why would take 35 years to answer. Garner had a description from Ida Pulaski, and no physical evidence linking it to anyone. He had no known enemies for Dennis, a retired roads department employee with a vegetable garden and a dead wife's tomatoes was not, on its face, a man who collected enemies. He had the medical examiner's finding, but no weapon and no witness to the act itself. He had, in 1987, what investigators called a stone wall case. Everything that should have pointed somewhere pointed into a void. The investigation pursued 3 directions. First, Garner looked at the small number of men Dennis had reported disputes with over the years. A neighbor boundary disagreement from 1981. A workplace grievance filed and withdrawn from his roads department days. Both were pursued, and both led nowhere. Second, he looked at Dennis's finances, wondering if there was something hidden in a quiet man's life that hadn't surfaced yet. There wasn't. Third, and most significantly, Garner focused on a man who had been seen in the neighborhood in the 2 weeks before Dennis disappeared. His name was Raymond Cutler. He was 44 years old in 1987, a former resident of Kankakee who had moved to Bradley 5 years earlier. He had a prior assault conviction from 1974, a drunk and disorderly from 1979. He had no obvious connection to Dennis Aldrich. But 2 neighbors had seen him walking the blocks between Merchant Street and Greenwood Avenue in late July, and Ida Pulaski, shown a photograph, said the man she had seen moving quickly on the night of August 6th could have been him. Could have. She could not be certain. Cutler was interviewed twice. He denied knowing Dennis. He denied being in the neighborhood that night. He had been drinking at a bar in Bradley, he said, the Hilltop Tap on Route 50, and 2 acquaintances confirmed he had been there, at least earlier in the evening. Whether he was still there at 9:30 was a question neither acquaintance could answer precisely. It wasn't enough. Not in 1987. Not without physical evidence. Not without a witness who could put him there with certainty. Not without anything that a prosecutor could take in front of a jury. Garner kept the file on his desk for 2 years. He pulled it out regularly, read through it, put it back. In 1989, a new case came in that consumed his attention for months. Then, another. The Aldrich file moved into the drawer. It did not move out again while Garner was still with the department. He retired in 1993. He left the file with the department's records division and a note in the folder that said, Raymond Cutler. Look again when you have something. Karen Aldrich, Dennis's daughter, had moved back to Kankakee by then, closer to Ruth, closer to what remained of her father in this city. She had stopped teaching. She worked at the county clerk's office. She made the Thursday dinners now, at her own house the same chicken fried steak, for Ruth, who was getting older and moving more slowly. They had the same conversation every few months about whether the case would ever go anywhere, and they had, over the years, developed a way of ending that conversation without despair. Not because they had hope, exactly, but because they had each other, and because giving in to despair felt like letting go of Dennis, and neither of them was willing to do that. By 2005, 18 years had passed. Raymond Cutler had moved twice since 1987, first to Peoria, then to Springfield. He was 62 now. He had stayed out of serious trouble, at least on paper. The Kankakee Cold Case Unit had reviewed the Aldrich file once in 2001 and noted Cutler's name but had no new evidence to act on. By 2015, 28 years had passed. Garner was 71 and living in retirement in Bourbon. Karen was 62. Ruth was 88 and in declining health. The case had been cold for longer than Dennis had been alive when it happened. We want to keep bringing cases like Dennis Aldrich's to the surface. Cases that sat quietly in filing cabinets while families waited, and we can only do that with your support. If this story matters to you, please like the video and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It makes a real difference. Now let's get back to Kankakee. In the spring of 2022, a retired schoolteacher named Beverly Ostrowski signed up for a free trial of a genealogy website. She was 64 years old, recently retired from 30 years of teaching middle school science in Bloomington. And she had decided that retirement was a good time to finally do the family history project she had been putting off since her mother died. She was looking for her maternal grandmother's family line, a branch that had roots in Poland and had come through Chicago in the 1910s. She had no particular agenda beyond curiosity. Beverly had not heard of Dennis Aldrich. She had never been to Kankakee. What she had was a methodical mind, a science teacher's comfort with databases and cross-referencing, and time. She found her grandmother's records within the first few days. But the way genealogy databases work, the way they surface DNA matches and flag common ancestors, meant that she was also, without looking for it, seeing the family connections of a distant cousin whose profile had been uploaded by someone else in the database. Following that thread was, as Beverly later described it to a local news outlet, just what you do when you see a loose end. The loose end led her, over the course of a Saturday afternoon and most of a Sunday, through a chain of family connections that eventually surfaced a name she did not recognize. Raymond Cutler, Springfield, Illinois. The database flagged him as a DNA match to a profile connected to a cold case sample submitted by the Kankakee County Sheriff's Office. Beverly stared at the screen. She read the flag again. She was a science teacher. She understood what DNA matches meant. She picked up her phone and called the Kankakee County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took her call was polite and, she later said, clearly not sure what to make of her. She explained carefully what she had found and what database she had found it in. He took her name and number. She thanked him and hung up. She was not certain anything would come of it. Something came of it. The detective who called Beverly back 2 days later was Corporal Diane Hewitt of the Kankakee County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit, a 10-year investigator who had worked the Aldrich file for the previous 3 years as part of a county initiative to reassess unsolved cases using genealogical DNA evidence. Hewitt had already submitted a crime scene DNA sample, recovered from Dennis's recovered clothing in 1987 and preserved in the evidence locker, to a public genealogy database. She had been waiting for a match to surface. Beverly Ostrowski had surfaced it without knowing she was looking. The process that Beverly had stumbled into, forensic genealogy, works by comparing crime scene DNA against the profiles of ordinary users who have uploaded their own genetic information to ancestry databases. When a close enough match is found, investigators can trace that match back through family trees to identify a most likely source. It requires careful work and legal review, but it has cracked cases that had no other door to open. Hewitt confirmed Beverly's finding and ran independent verification through the Illinois State Police Forensic Laboratory. She built the family tree herself, working backward from the database matches, cross-referencing birth records and county documents. Every branch led to Raymond Cutler. Hewitt pulled the original 1987 file. She read Garner's note, Raymond Cutler. Look again when you have something. We have something, she said quietly, to no one in particular, and then she picked up the phone. Cutler was 79 years old by 2022. He was living in a rental apartment in Springfield, in declining health, largely alone. When investigators arrived at his door on a Tuesday morning in September 2022, 35 years after Dennis Aldrich had walked home from his sister's house and not arrived, Cutler opened the door and looked at the badge and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been waiting a while for this." He was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Dennis Wayne Aldrich. He did not deny it. In a recorded interview conducted that same day, documented in court records filed with the Kankakee County Circuit Court, Cutler stated that he had followed Dennis from Ruth Street that night because of a dispute he said dated back to their years as neighbors in the 1970s. A grievance he described as festering for years. He described Dennis as having wronged him in a matter he presented as significant. Investigators who reviewed the original file and the subsequent interview noted that the grievance, as Cutler described it, was so minor it barely registered. A property line argument, an old complaint about noise, the kind of friction that happens between neighbors and is forgotten within a season. Dennis Aldrich had forgotten it. Raymond Cutler had not. He had carried it for a decade, moved away with it, watched it grow into something unrecognizable. And then, on a warm August evening, when the river was close and the streets were quiet, he had acted on it. Raymond Cutler was found competent to stand trial. Given his age and health, the Kankakee County State's attorney negotiated a plea arrangement entered in January 2023, under which Cutler pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to 17 years, the equivalent, under the circumstances, of a life sentence for a man of 79. He entered the Illinois Department of Corrections in the spring of 2023. Karen Aldrich was in the courtroom. She was 69 years old. Ruth had died the previous year, at 96, without knowing the outcome. Karen held, in her coat pocket, a Polaroid photograph, one of the garden pictures Dennis had taken the summer before he died. The tomatoes just coming in, the backyard in afternoon light, everything still. She did not speak to Cutler. She had decided she had nothing to say to him. She said everything she needed to say at the memorial service held for Dennis in the spring of 2023. The one Karen organized at the church on Greenwood Avenue. The same church where his funeral had been held 35 years before. Where his neighbors and his sister's friends and people from the roads department had come to say goodbye, without yet knowing it was murder they were grieving. This time, they knew. And knowing, somehow, made it possible to grieve properly, to be angry and to be sad in the right proportions, to hold Dennis in their minds as a man who was taken rather than a man who simply left the world. Beverly Ostrowski came to the service. Karen had called and invited her, and Beverly had driven the 90 miles from Bloomington without hesitation. They had not met before that day. After the service, standing in the parking lot in the thin spring sunlight, Karen thanked her. Beverly said she had really just been following a loose end on a Saturday afternoon. That's all it took, Karen said. 35 years of nothing, and that's all it took. There is something in that sentence worth sitting with. 35 years of nothing, of Garner's note in a folder, of Karen's Sunday calls, of Ruth's Thursday dinners slowly becoming fewer, of Raymond Cutler aging in Springfield, while the grievance he had turned into a murder quietly followed him around. And then a retired schoolteacher on a free trial subscription, following a loose end on a Saturday, with no agenda except curiosity. The genealogy databases that Beverly used are the same ones millions of people have uploaded their DNA to for entirely ordinary reasons. To find a grandmother's village in Poland, to connect a family branch that immigration scattered, to answer a question about where they come from. They did not upload their information to solve crimes, but the information, once in the database, exists, and investigators like Diane Hewitt know how to ask it the right questions. Since 2018, forensic genealogy has helped close more than 500 violent crime cases across the United States, including cases that had been dormant for 40 and 50 years. Dennis Aldrich's case took 35. There is a quiet argument to be made that it could have been solved sooner if the technology had existed sooner, and a quieter argument that without Beverly Ostrowski following a loose end on a Saturday, it might not have been solved at all, that the match was in the database waiting and waiting for someone to notice it. Dennis Aldrich was 62 years old. He had a vegetable garden and a dead wife's tomatoes, and a Thursday routine and a daughter who called on Sundays. He walked a route he had walked 100 times and did not make it home. And for 35 years the man who stopped him went on living, a few cities away, carrying something he should have let go of long before it became what it became. He thought distance was enough, He thought time was enough. He thought that a warm August night and a river and 35 years would be sufficient. He was wrong. There are questions this case raises that go beyond the verdict. Does it concern you that the break in this case came from a civilian using a commercial database that most people signed up for without thinking about law enforcement access? Where do you think the line should be between using genealogy databases to solve violent crimes and protecting the privacy of people who uploaded their DNA for entirely personal reasons? And what do you make of the grievance Cutler described? Something so small that Dennis had apparently forgotten it entirely, being carried for a decade before it became murder. Leave your answer in the comments. Justice found Dennis Aldrich 35 years after a warm August night in Kankakee. It came through a detective who kept the file alive and a retired schoolteacher who followed a loose end on a Saturday. Stories like his are why this work exists. If you believe that truth is worth the time it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.